very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a pleasure to join this budget debate. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't talk about the white member for Hyderabad. Okay. Mr. Speaker, this is the Minister of Finance's second budget statement and this government's fourth since assuming office. My expectation was that by now they would have demonstrated some evidence that they were getting better. But alas, Mr. Speaker, just like the recent cabinet reshuffle, they seem to be stuck in a paradigm which sees them glued to a worn-out strategy of spend, spend, spend as the sole response to tackling the issues confronted by the population on a daily basis. Mr. Speaker, before I move on, I would like to congratulate the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Digger Martin West, for his sterling presentation. And I would also like to congratulate my colleagues who presented before me. Mr. Speaker, the government and the minister had a golden opportunity to inspire a population reeling on the daily dosages of wanton and unnecessary wastage of young lives from gruesome and chilling. A lot of stuff is happening in many communities, Mr. Speaker, and I feel that at this time, I felt that the budget debate could have dealt with that also. Mr. Speaker, the budget presentation, which generally grips the attention of the general population, could have been used as a tool to restore some confidence in the national community that all is not lost and there is hope and a brighter future ahead, particularly for those misguided youths of our nation. Needless to say, Mr. Speaker, that was expecting too much from this government. Perhaps the only redeeming aspect of this year's budget presentation is that, unlike last year, the nation has been spared of that ill-conceived, ill-advised, and disgraceful display of a partisan pre-budget rally. Mr. Speaker, what are some of the main features of this budget as presented by the Minister of Finance? It lacks details in many critical areas, thereby making it almost impossible to appreciate, assess, or analyze the particular policy prescriptions and measures outlined. And one example is the Caribbean Airlines, and property tax actually is another example that comes to mind. Although the budget statement assumed the caption of sustaining growth, securing prosperity, a theme which depicts lofty ideals, there was not the philosophical nor the clinical underpinnings which would have defined or targeted what these ideals were, nor were there the processes to be pursued toward the realization of these ideals. In many respects, the budget statement represents a rehash of many of the measures, policies, and prescriptions of earlier budgets presented by this government. In fact, many of the projects which were identified by the previous minister and from previous years somehow found their way into this current budget. The sharp increases in budgeted expenditure continues unabated, such that over the four budgets presented by this government, expenditure has grown from 51.5 billion in fiscal 2010-2011 to 61.4 billion in the current year, a whooping increase of almost 20% in just 3 years, and there appears to be no apparent concerns about the implications of this reckless spending spree for the national economy. Mr. Speaker, this year's budget represents the sixth consecutive national budget deficit presented to the nation. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? According to the Minister of Finance, he is committed to putting this country through another 2 years of budget deficit, because he says very loudly in his budget statement, and I quote, "The government is successfully containing the fiscal deficit in accordance with its policy objectives and is on course to bring the fiscal account into balance by 2016, end of quote, and cunningly attempts to disguise the impact of the deficit by expressing it as a ratio to GDP. Mr. Speaker, there is no urgency on the part of the government to exercise fiscal prudence and discipline in the management of the country's finances. fiscal prudence and discipline will not suit their political agenda. Hence, the budget routine is very predictable and static. But, Mr. Speaker, let me just outline what has been this government's record in the management of the finances of this nation in the 4 budgets presented to date. In 2010-2011, budget deficit of $3.9 billion. In 2011-2012, a budget deficit of $3.5 billion. 2012-2013, a budget deficit of $6.5 billion. And 2013-2014, budget deficit of $6.3 billion. In the 4 budgets presented to the nation by this government, they have racked up a cumulative fiscal deficit of $20.2 billion, equivalent to 30% of the budget we are considering today. You see, Mr. Speaker, not so long ago, many of those who sit on the other side today had accused the PNM of reckless and profligate spending. The evidence shows, Mr. Speaker, that this government is the most reckless that this country has ever seen in the management of this country's purse. But, Mr. Speaker, it does not stop there. As this band of merry men and women continue to pillage the nation's treasury, what it does simultaneously is the imposition on this current and future generation a debt burden which they will have to bear long after this government would have been driven out of office. In summary, if I am to make an assessment of this budget, it will be same old, same old. Nothing new, nothing that we have not heard before, very little creativity to propel the economy. If there is economic growth, it will be by happenstance, subjected to the vagaries of the external marketplace for primary export products from the energy sector. This budget, the 4th of this government, would mean that to date they would have spent a total of $223.2 billion. And just to put it in context, Mr. Speaker, it took the PNM 7 years to spend what this UNC-led coalition government took 4 years to spend. And by its next budget, Mr. Speaker, this government would have overhauled in 5 budgets what the PNM took 8 years to spend. Mr. Speaker, I wish to focus my remarks on Tobago specifically. And Mr. Speaker, permit me to first of all to thank the Minister for his acknowledgement of the way in which the Tobago House of Assembly handled itself with respect to the timeliness of its budgetary submission to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Finance. The respect for the law and its obligation is a quality for which Tobagoanians are well known, and it is commendable that the Minister would have publicly recognized the Chief Secretary and the Secretary of Finance for their efforts in this regard. Unfortunately, however, Mr. Speaker, although having received the required documents from Tobago on time, and although having consulted on more than one occasion with the THA officials, the Minister appeared to have neither fully appreciated the contents of the documents nor the subsequent oral submissions made by the THA, nor the enormity of the development challenges that Tobago face. Mr. Speaker, the Minister boasted in his budget statement that Tobago would receive some $3.309 billion or 5.3% of the 2014 budget. What he tried to sweep under the carpet is the fact that the allocation to the Tobago House of Assembly for fiscal year 2015 is actually $2.45 billion. And this is ordinarily referred to as a budgetary slate of hand. And the fact is that, contrary to the Minister's boast, the share of the national budget actually allocated to the THA is at its minimum, given Tobago's well-established developmental needs. It is much less than the 8% that was proposed as part of their failed attempt to seduce Tobago to get their votes in January. Indeed, the Minister, with all the smoke and mirrors at his disposal, attempted to hoodwink the people of Tobago by referring to the allocation for use in Tobago by the member for Tobago West and his other cabinet colleagues, even though he knows that such expenditure in accordance with the THA Act, does not form part of the THA allocation, and that the Dispute Resolution Commission ruling speaks quite correctly to the allocations that are to be made to the THA and THA alone. So, Mr. Speaker, the allocations to major specific projects and programs to aid in Tobago's development have fallen woefully short for yet another year. The case for the Assembly Scholarship Program for young people is a stark example. Given the well-known human resource capacity constraints to Tobago's development, the Assembly requested some $6 million to finance this program in 2014. Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister allocated $1 million to the Assembly, an amount that cannot even cover the cost of Tobagonians already registered for the 2014 academic year. But the problem does not stop there. Take the case of the infrastructural development at Cove that is so critical to transforming the Tobago economy. The $2 million allocated for capital works at the business park for 2014 can hardly build a factory shell of average size. This is coming from the same minister and the same government that continuously proclaim the need to diversify the Tobago economy. Mr. Speaker, despite all the rhetoric about an appropriate share of the budget for the THA, the allocation to housing for Tobago provides an excellent example of how this UNC words are one thing, their deeds are another, and never shall the two meet. In fact, faced with the excess of 6,000 applications for public sector housing in Tobago, the allocation of $28.4 million for all housing projects and related activities will result in a situation in 2014 where the Assembly has had financing for the construction of a maximum of 25 homes in Tobago in the next year. Compare this with the funded provision for 2,000 units in new projects in Tobago. And as a matter of fact, the member for Oropouche East recently, just before me, spoke about these new projects in Trinidad. And Mr. Speaker, where is the equity here? Where in Tobago, there's only allocation financing here for 25 homes. And in Trinidad, the funds provided for 2,000 units. This could never be fair. Mr. Speaker, how does the minister explain the meager allocation of $8 million to complete the Scarborough Library in the face of a requirement for $40 million for a project that is long overdue, largely because of sporadic and insufficient funding? How can $8 million be enough to complete the Shore Park Cultural Complex when the project's completion costs are currently estimated at $75 million? And what they got was $8 million, Mr. Speaker. Why does the minister believe that $2 million is sufficient to allow the Assembly to continue to protect Tobago's heritage in the next fiscal year through the Heritage Land Trust? With which THA secretary did he consult in his effort to impose a so-called Northeast Tobago Growth Pole Plan on Tobago, when the Assembly has already articulated its views in its recently updated Comprehensive Development Plan for Tobago, a copy of which I am aware was passed on to the Minister of Finance? If the minister truly cared about Tobago's young people, how does he justify his minimal allocation to Tobago's Young Professionals Program in the face of a request by the THA of $12 million? We are here if we are to assist in a resurgence of agriculture in Tobago to contribute to the nation's food security. How does the minister explain the meager $5 million allocation for agricultural access roads in Tobago? $5 million out of a budget of $60 billion to develop some of the most fertile lands. And when you're talking so frequently about growing more food to bring down the food import bill. And they want to go to Guyana to develop land to produce the same things that they fail to produce in Tobago. how does the minister plan to explain to hundreds of Tobago families that there is no allocation for CPEP in Tobago fiscal 2014? I would like the Minister of Finance to explain that, because the member for Urupuch East just spoke about CPEP and boasted about CPEP in Trinidad. Why wasn't there any allocation for CPEP in Tobago, Mr. Speaker? How does the minister explain away the fact that his budgetary allocation of 19 million to URP in Tobago falls way below the 65 million spent in fiscal 2013 and the 70 million requested for fiscal 2014?